In November 1956, something happened that changed the world forever. The most powerful empire in human history, an empire that had ruled a quarter of the Earth's surface, an empire whose currency had dominated global trade for over a century, was brought to its knees in just 11 days. And that too, just by a phone call. On that phone call, the United States government delivered an ultimatum to Britain: stop your military operation in Egypt immediately, or we will collapse your currency. We will sell every British pound we own. We will veto your emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund, and we will watch your economy burn. Britain had no choice. Within hours, the greatest empire the world had ever seen surrendered, not to an enemy army, but to its own debt, to its own weakness, to the reality that it was no longer the power it believed itself to be. That moment, known as the Suez Crisis, was the final nail in the coffin of British global dominance. But here is what they do not teach you in school. Britain did not fall because of that one crisis. Britain fell because for decades before that moment, it had been making the exact same mistakes that America is making right now, and by 2026 those mistakes may finally catch up with us. Let me show you exactly what happened, because when you see the pattern, you will never look at America the same way again. To understand how Britain fell, you first have to understand how Britain rose. In the 1800s, Britain was the master of the global economy. The British pound wasn't just a currency, it was the currency. When countries traded, they used pounds. When central banks stored reserves, they stored pounds. When global contracts were written, they were written in pounds. That gave Britain a superpower. They could borrow cheaply, they could fund their military, they could run deficits and still survive because the world needed their currency. Sound familiar? Well, it should, but underneath that power the foundation was already cracking. By the late 1800s, the United States had surpassed Britain as the world's largest economy. American factories were outproducing British factories. American innovation was accelerating. American wealth was exploding. But the pound stayed dominant because the world was used to it. The system was built around it. Changing reserve currencies is like trying to replace the engine of a plane while it's still flying, so Britain's currency stayed strong even as Britain itself was weakening. Then World War I started. Britain borrowed massive amounts to finance the war, and when the war ended, Britain had transformed from the world's biggest creditor into one of the world's biggest debtors, especially to the United States. Now Britain had a choice. It could accept reality and scale down, or it could pretend that nothing has changed. Britain chose denial. In 1925, Britain made one of the worst financial decisions of the entire century. They returned to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate, meaning they tried to make the pound look as strong as it used to be, even though the country behind it was no longer that strong. It was all ego, and it was devastating. To keep the pound artificially high, Britain had to keep interest rates painfully high. That crushed growth, that crushed jobs, that made British exports too expensive. Meanwhile, British leaders kept spending like they still ran the world. They kept military bases across the globe. They kept funding an empire they could no longer afford.